Favorites. We've got chapter 2 of More Misery-Cus. So let's see what chapter 2 is. Chapter 2. More Apparitions. "Ask me not," he said, and moving, passed it into the distance dim. High the sun stood in the heavens, but no shadow followed him. Stevie Smith's poem, The Parklands. Iron County gives us a nice long story in the old tradition of both romance and gross details. It's said to have taken place in 1860, during an era when Missouri's Methodist churches sponsored a small college at Arcadia. Many such schools existed at the time, offering young people higher education without the expenses and other problems of traveling far from home. Some were able to commute to these schools each day, but probably more stayed on campus or boarded in the town. Near Arcadia lived Judge Allen Holloman, with his wife and their large family of children, a few of whom attended the nearby college. Holloman was one of the most prominent men in the area, owner of a mill and a great deal of land that included several rental farms, possibly to help them control activities of their own children. The Hollomans made their home more or less an open house for young people. Students gathered there on weekend nights for visiting, games, music, and refreshments. The walk from campus was not long, and overarching trees made it picturesque and pleasant in almost any weather. Among Holloman's numerous descendants was a grandson named Paul Hinchy, born the year after events that created a family ghost story with such distasteful aspects that it was spoken of in whispers, if at all. While he grew up, in maturity, Hinchy wrote down all he had been able to find out, carefully giving fictitious names to the real people who had been affected. The students coming to Holloman's frequently included a young woman, beautiful in appearance, personality, and character, whom Hinchley called Agnes Powell. Though she was popular, Agnes never paired up with any young man for outings, and she declined invitations for anything but group activities. She seemed to be taking care not to show particular interest in any one suitor. The exception was a boy Hinchley called Doug Miller. Doug came from far enough back in the Ozark Hills that his speech and manners were different from his classmates, and he was very anxious to change this. Handsome and a good student, he wanted to make the social impressions necessary to realize his ambitions. Perhaps Doug appealed to Agnes for help. Perhaps she volunteered it, but she did devote many hours to tutoring Doug on dictation and etiquette. She was always careful, however, that the two of them were never alone together. One afternoon, when Doug happened to be absent, the mystery of Agnes's aloofness was solved. An expensive carriage drawn by a fine team of bays pulled up to the judge's gate, and at sight of the young man alighting, Agnes ran and clasped him in warm embrace. "My fiancé," she told her friends proudly, and then the couple explained how they had been secretly plighted for years. Robert Baker had waited to declare himself to his beloved's father until he could truthfully say he had the wherewithal to keep Agnes in the comfort she'd always known. The father now had given his blessing, and Baker wanted Agnes to leave with him the following morning for their hometown and begin wedding preparations. Agnes's friends were sorry to lose her sweet company, but rejoiced with her. They were still twittering about the perfection of it all when Doug Miller joined them on the evening of the day Agnes departed. He became silent, his face held carefully blank, so that all his schoolmates realized with pity that he had read too much into Agnes's attention to him. Nobody knew what to do or say, as Doug broke away and abruptly hurried off. Doug was not in classes for the next few days, but nobody sought him out. His friends supposed he preferred not facing them just yet. When they found he'd abandoned his rental room, they'd assumed he was so hurt and humiliated he had gone back home. In their conversation, though, they discovered that nobody really knew exactly where he was from. Some were sure he'd said both his parents were dead, and he'd sold his legacy, the family farm, to finance his education. He had nowhere to go, so where was he? Before long, young people strolling the road to Holloman's began remarking an unpleasant odor, and the misfortune that must have befallen some wild animal or domestic beast. As days passed, the odor grew so strong that attendants at the gatherings fell off. A couple of the young men, perhaps suspecting the truth, followed the smell to its source and were aghast to find that someone had hanged himself in the woods. The body's clothing and a nearby hat told them it was Doug Miller. They immediately sought Judge Holloman's advice, and his first word to them was to tell nobody for the time being. He summoned the sheriff, and after consultation, these two community leaders told the boy to bring digging tools from Holloman's barn. All four went together to deal with Doug's body. The judge and sheriff decreed that for health reasons Doug must be buried at once. They directed digging right under his hanging body so it would fall into the grave when cut down. The condition of the body and embalming methods of the time left little choice, particularly since nobody had any idea who, if anyone, would want to know about Doug's death. Though this seemed callous by today's standard, we must remember that options were limited in that era. Getting tongue-tied. All involved were much distressed that a good, hopeful, hard-working young person must die wretchedly and be buried like an animal, grown offensive, buried with no marker. They swore to each other to keep the secret, but it got out, and other secrets led to others and others. First strange report came from the judge's two youngest sons. Within a week or so of the burial, they said they were awakened by the watchdogs barking and saw in the moonlight, streaming through their second-story window, a young man sitting on the sill. When the brothers advanced toward the image, it disappeared, but they had looked long enough to be agreed that it was Doug Miller. Down in the yard, they could see their dog staring, wrapped in the direction of the woods where Miller had hanged himself. Their father ordered the boys not to talk about this outside the family, but other people began to report seeing an unknown man walking in the tunnel of trees that led to Holloman's. Even more dramatic, one of the other Holloman sons, riding home from town one night, had unaccustomed travel with his normally docile horse. It balked and could not be made to take another step into the tunnel. After trying everything that a horse-savvy young man of the day knew to try, he gave up and rode back to town. There he waited until he found two horsemen together who would be passing his father's house. By positioning his mount between theirs, he was able to get home. After a few weeks, strange happenings in the tunnel abated, and gradually the tragedy lost its priority in conversation. Students could once again concentrate on school and gatherings at the judges, which had become almost as big and jolly as ever. But in a year or so, a traveler through the town asked whether Doug Miller was still in the college, and had explained his curiosity. The couple who bought the house where Doug was reared had been asking about him. Someone who looked like Doug was moving around their property. This person appeared then by night and by day and acted strangely. They were becoming fearful. Where was Doug? Was he sure enough still alive and in school? Connoisseurs of things ghostly would say this is a classic example of a spirit leaving its body under conditions of such mental anguish that some time was needed for gaining strength to face the next stage of existence. They would say it was perfectly natural for Doug Miller's spirit to stay near the scene of his death for a few weeks. He had finally gained enough orientation to get back home, and from there, if all went as it should, he would soon strike off into the hereafter. Paul Hensey did not remark about the length of time Doug may have been said to haunt his early environment. He did comment in his paper that Agnes and her husband were never bothered by the sad ghost of a young man who had loved her too much. A phantom with a purpose. Perhaps there should be a chapter just about ghosts who seem to have a reason for appearing, or for ghosts who, despite what the experts tell us, seem to have physical powers, such as one appeared in a paper connected with Mark Twain that may or may not be totally fiction. The famous writer at times declared himself a skeptic about the supernatural. Yet it's on record that from 1885 to 1903 he was a member of the American Society for Psychical Research. What follows appeared in the autumn 1848 issue of the Pacific Spectator. The article, titled "Ghost Life on the Mississippi," was introduced by a supposed great-niece who said the manuscript turned up in her childhood home, where Clemens was a frequent visitor. She also said the famous writer's mother was a great believer in ghosts and had a large collection of accounts of supernatural experiences that were personal or came from people she knew. The story that follows concerned a riverboat pilot named William Jones. On a certain wildly stormy night, he defied his captain, who told him to tie the boat up because they were nearing an especially dangerous bend in the river, and driving snow would make it too hard for him to navigate. Having earlier that day been derided by some of his colleagues for his pomposity and called King of Pilots, Jones was in the mood for showing everyone a thing or two. He safely took the boat Boreas through the snag-infested shallows with sharp bends that were challenging on a clear day. To another pilot who tried to discourage him, he was sent to reply, "I'll take her through if the devil seizes me for it 5 minutes afterwards." Jones was never seen again, though some blood stains on the deck indicated someone had been injured there. When the Boreas reached St. Louis, she was sold, laid up for refurbishment, and not taken out again for almost a year. When she went, one of her pilots was a man called Joseph Millard, who had known Jones and his great feat. Millard was resolved to never do anything so foolhardily. When weather signs pointed to a bad night, he began at once to look for a safe place to tie up. Unfortunately, hard-driven snow descended on the boat before he reached refuge, and because he could not see the bank, Millard had the engine turned off. Gradually, alone there in the dark, Millard began to feel a strange presence, and soon, by occasional flashes of light that came through the holes in the stovepipe, he saw a vaguely outlined human form opposite him at the wheel. One larger than usual flash revealed the terrible, ravaged face of William Jones. Fixed and lustreless eyes, Clemens wrote, and he described disheveled hair and bloated appearance, suggesting a drowned corpse. According to the story, Millard's blood curdled in his veins, and he trembled in every limb. He could neither move nor speak, and could not prevent the wheels being wrenched from him. The signal to restart engines was given, and as power returned, Miller watched the wheel make calm and delicate movements, as if in a master hand. He expected momentary crashing sounds, but none came. Flashes of light showed Millard's guest had turned towards the door, opening it and departing. "You've outdone Jones himself," Millard's relief pilot told him in awe a few minutes later. The conclusion of this story had no doubt proved that it was fiction. It was that the two men found on the floor a pocket watch, crystal broken, but engraved with Jones's name. If there is any truth to this, it may be that an angry pilot once did an amazing feat to silence his critics. But Dorothy Schrader of Herman, daughter and granddaughter of riverboat men, confirms that in earlier years the sincere belief in ghosts was deeper and more common than it is today. In Steamboat Treasures, second volume of her trilogy of river books, she told how easily roustabouts and deckhands could be kept at their work long after hours. They merely had to be reminded that after midnight ghosts could walk. Everyone had to best finish loading or unloading while they could do so safely. From a reliable source. For many years, the late Leonard Hall of Caledonia wrote a highly respected column for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and when that newspaper folded, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I never saw him deal with any subjects but nature, rural living, and conservation. However, a friend tells me that Hall did a column in his later years describing an event that he had discussed with nobody until that time. It took place on a sandbar in the upper current, while Hall was on a float trip with several other people. Wakened by unfamiliar sounds, he left his cot to look out the tent door. Not more than 100 yards away, he said, were campfires and tended by Indians in breechcloths. Around the fires, eating, sat men wearing armor, which he recognized as Spanish by the helmet style. The sight was so stunning and bizarre that Hall just went back to bed, thinking he was dreaming or hallucinating, and embarrassed to call anyone else to look. But the minutely detailed incident stayed vividly in his mind. If he was going to hallucinate, why about Spanish soldiers? Although the friend did not say so, Hall might well have questioned the good sense of men wearing their armor to dinner. Surely the first thing they wanted at the end of the day was to be rid of it all. It would be hot in the summer, cold in cold weather, and would severely limit movement. Some types of armor would have made it difficult to sit down on the ground, and maybe impossible to get up without help. On the other hand, if they did not fully trust their guides, or if they feared being picked off by arrows shot from the dark, maybe soldiers would leave on helmets and whatever protected their backs and chest, at least until cooking fires were out and the diners were less obvious targets. In any case, many years later, Hall came across the fact that Hernando de Soto led a party into the area in 1561, and that he used Indian guides, possibly experts would classify that Hall saw not as apparitions, but as an example of a time slip of people inexplicably drifting for a few minutes into someone else's time. Now you see it. Another type of apparition discussed often in archives of the supernatural casts its images onto film. Through the photographer sees no one before him. In 1894, a Missouri Life article about Missouri ghosts told of a man in Iron County who went to visit a farm where he grew up. The place had changed hands, and the house had been extensively remodeled. From outside, however, one portion looked much the same as in his childhood, and he decided to take a picture of the low-roofed back porch where he often played. When his film was developed, one of the windows seemed to hold a fairly distinct image of a man with a white beard, apparently leaning close to the panes from a sitting position. It resembled an elderly family member, long deceased, who had in his last years of life spent most of his time sitting by that window in that position. The visitor, having been inside the house, knew that base cabinets had been built under the window of that particular room. There was no way a person could have been sitting there. So as a test, the photographer showed the picture without comment to several of his siblings and cousins. Some of them exclaimed involuntarily, "Look, that looks like..." Others saw nothing, which is why collecting ghost stories is so fascinating. Jeremy, sweetheart, what do you fear? Nothing, my darling, nothing is here. Jeremy, sweetheart, what do you flee? Something, I don't know, something I see. William Rose Bennett, The Skater on Ghost Lake. Then shall dust return the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God, who gave it. The Bible, Aeschylodes. The Lord, in whose hand is the soul of every living thing. Job 12:9-10, King James Version. Who knows whether the spirit of a human being goes upward or whether the spirit of a beast goes downward to the earth? Aeschylodes, the Revised English Bible. But man dieth and wasteth away. Man giveth up the ghost, and where is he? The Bible, Job. He was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. The Bible, Acts. That's the end of chapter 2.